So welcome everybody to today's podcast. My name is Jim Hodges, Chief Analyst at Heavy Reading, and today I'm joined by Angela Logothetis. Angela is the Amdocs Open Network CTO. So Angela, we're going to be talking about OSS automation in today's podcast, and it's a really important topic. You know, we've been talking about cloud networks for about 8 years, and obviously that now is pretty much commonplace with 5G rollouts happening now. And I think it does kind of also refocus the discussion on OSS transformation, OSS monetization, and OSS, the role of automation in OSS transformation. So I just wanted to kind of start off with maybe kind of a general question. And what do you see in terms of the telco industry? What do you see as sort of the state of play or the rollout of automation in telco networks today?
Yeah, hi Jim. So it's really good to be talking to you today and talking about one of my favorite topics, which is automation. Look, I would say that automation is very high on the strategic priority list of most service providers that we deal with. And you mentioned in the opening that, we've been on the path to virtualization or cloud networks for the last 8 or so years. And a big part of the promise of virtualization was automation. And it's certainly one of the big attractions of the next move from physical to virtualization into cloud native. It's all around the automation that it will bring. And so I think what we see with service providers is they see the opportunity as they launch new 5G networks and new cloud native networks to really transform the way they operate these networks from fairly highly manual operations today to digital and automated operations in the future.
Interesting. I think, when you think of automation, we know it's going to transform service provider networks, and we know it's going to have huge impacts. I guess, the concept of automation is so broad, though. I'm wondering, from your thoughts, a lot of service providers probably really haven't started to automate their OSS BSS systems. And I'm just wondering, and I guess there's obviously a number of reasons for that: complexity, having strategic vision. They've already gone through maybe a network transformation of their OSS BSS systems kind of before automation. I'm just kind of wondering if you kind of see what are sort of the some of the downsides if some of these service providers haven't really started this automation process yet.
Yeah, so I think we see service providers with, pretty good visions around what they want to end up as in terms of digital service providers and automated operations. But I think we see fairly fragmented starting points, or piecemeal starting points, if you like. So we see service providers using scripting tools and RPA tools to kind of automate individual tasks or highly repetitive tasks. And that'll really help take some of the costs out of the network of today, and it will help free up some people so that they can start to move to thinking about designing and deploying the networks that they need going forward. But it's not really achieving their end state vision of, highly automated closed loop operations of the future. So the next thing we see service providers starting to do is to start to put in place new automation capabilities, automation, intelligence, orchestration, but really doing it around specific domains. So if they put a new radio network in, they'll put some automation around that. Or if they put a new over-the-top SD-WAN service in, they'll do some automation around that. But really what they're trying to get to at the end of the day is end-to-end process automation. How do I launch a new service to market? How do I get a new customer onto my network? How do I run my network 24/7 at 6 nines reliability? These are the sorts of things that they're grappling with.
So is it fair to say maybe that the automation trigger for these service providers is deploying new technology? Is that, like you said, we think of 5G networks, automation is a key part of that. We think of SD-WAN, programmability, automation is a big key part. We think of security. I cover security. Automation is a huge part of security in terms of policy.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
So is it fair to say that the way the automation is being rolled out is by kind of technology or new generation, and then they'll kind of go back and kind of move that into kind of more of a holistic approach all the way through their existing, their current networks and even their non-cloud-based networks? Is that sort of a strategy?
Yeah. So I think that's a really good observation. So I think when you think about networks. Networks are obviously driven by the next wave of network technology. So we do see a heavy wave of, we saw automation first start to come into play as they move from physical to virtual networks, with success in some places, but maybe it didn't fully realize the vision that the service providers had. But now as they move into 5G networks, into cloud native networks, into SD-WAN networks, they're really seeing the opportunity to automate those networks. So if you like, do a new network in a new way, right? Do it right from the beginning. So that's certainly one trigger. I think the other two triggers around this are, one, the digital experience, right? You and I as consumers, and then the corporations that we work for, everyone's getting used to this idea of you interact digitally. And so service providers are looking at, well, how do we do that digital experience, not just at the shop front or the call center, but how do we let a customer digitally interact with our network? So I think that's the second thing that's driving automation, because if you automate the front of house, but the back of house is still a lot of people out manually doing things in the network, then you don't really get that digital customer engagement that they're looking for. So that's the second thing that's driving it. And I think the third thing that's driving it is really just the scale and complexity of networks that they're now starting to deal with. And we've actually got one customer that's saying, hey, let's slow down with all of this technology adoption, because we have to keep these networks going. And I think especially now in the era where we're doing so much digitally, we're educating our kids digitally, we're working from home digitally, we're doing all of our online socializing digitally, we're doing all of our shopping and everything else around our lives digitally. These networks are absolutely key, and I think there's a reluctance to actually fundamentally change those networks unless there's a really good way of managing them, and automation is the way of managing them. So I think people are saying until we've got the automation in place, then we really can't be adopting some of this new technology that's coming along, because it'll just be too difficult to manage.
Interesting. And maybe going back to something you said there. I mean, I started my career with a service provider, and I remember whenever we worked on a project, there was always kind of an OSS, BSS, the days of the mops, going back a ways, and there was always some sort of a something that had to be done in terms of OSS, BSS modifications, and there was always a workaround. You could always find a workaround. And I'm just wondering, so I mean, obviously this is pretty something that's common in all service provider networks, have some sort of workarounds in their OSS, BSS systems. I'm just wondering, how do service providers kind of introduce automation and sort of manage kind of this legacy quilt work of workarounds as well?
Yeah, I think early on in my career, I heard something along the lines of, the longest lasting systems in the organization are the interim systems or the workarounds, because nobody ever fully understands them well enough to actually, ever replace them with something more permanent. And look, there are a lot of workarounds, and I think the great thing about workarounds is you could do something in a very quick way. I think the downside around workarounds is they really don't scale particularly well, right? And you end up with workaround on top of workaround on top of workaround, and you're not really kind of getting the efficiency or the automation that you really want. So kind of the way we think about it is, put in place, and network guys are really good at doing this, right? Put in place the right architecture, pick the right architecture, pick the right vendor or partner that you're going to deal with, and then do small things on top of that, okay? Automate one domain or automate one process. And so instead of just doing workarounds in a very ad hoc manner, actually take a platform-based approach, but put the workaround onto that platform, and then continually improve the workaround and tune it until you're happy with it, and then make it permanent. And that's kind of the approach that we're taking with next generation OSS.
Okay. And so do you kind of see that as the way that service providers will move into automation? Is that, I mean, obviously as they deploy new technologies, that's kind of a trigger, but then this other trigger is that, as you said, they kind of look back into their legacy side of their network, and then they'd be able to sort of fine tune that and kind of migrate sort of that functionality. Is that something that is starting to happen now? Are you starting to see service providers actually starting to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've sort of spent a lot of time with service providers mapping out how do you get to this end state vision of closed loop automation, and we've mapped out 6 different journeys that we see customers taking. But effectively, it is a journey, and it is, you have to start with what you've got today. If you're going to be a greenfield service provider, and look, there's a couple of big names in the market that are doing that, right, and they've achieved pretty high levels of automation because they were greenfield. But the majority of service providers in the market, they kind of don't have that luxury. Even launching 5G, 5G is not a greenfield network today. It started off as 5G non-standalone, so it was a blend of the 5G radio with the 4G core. And service providers have always had this combination of legacy or today's networks and legacy or yesterday's networks and today's networks and future networks that they're putting in place. And the challenge for them is how do you automate across those and make the network work end to end? And that's where this approach of certainly start 5G and cloud native in the right way and make that heavily automated, but also be able to use the same platform to go through your networks of today, and we kind of call it a hybrid network, to be able to drive automation into that network as well.
Interesting. I guess to start the transformation, to start the shift to OSS transformation, are there kind of sort of fundamental steps that service providers should be taking to kind of introduce automation? You talked about kind of looking back and new technologies, but are there sort of maybe a couple of logical starting points to kind of kickstart that process of OSS automation?
Yeah, so I think the first is, and you identified it at the start of our conversation, is when you're putting in place a new technology. Okay, so don't put a new technology into the network and operate it the way you did yesterday's technology, right? Look at it and say, well, if I was a greenfield provider or if I was a cloud service provider, how would I be implementing this technology in a highly automated way? So that's one obvious starting point. I think the second is when they're launching new services out to market, and we spoke a little bit about SD-WAN as an example earlier. And we're starting to see people starting to grapple with private enterprise network services, for example, which again will need a high level of automation to be able to cope with, I guess, the level of customizations that those services need, and to be able to do that at scale. And then we see just operational efficiency, right? And the bigger these networks get, the more complex these networks get. Service providers are looking at it and saying, well, look, I hope to grow my revenue, but we know that costs are growing faster than revenue, so we have to get more efficient about what we do. So how can we automate what we do today?
Okay.
And so they're kind of the 3 starting points.
Okay. So you talked about some of the benefits of OSS automation. I mean, can you sort of give some more examples of maybe service providers starting to kind of see the benefits of automation in next-gen OSS infrastructure systems? We've been doing automation for a couple of years, so it's still early days, but have you seen any sort of quick wins by some of the service providers?
Yeah, so a really good example is I think one of our customers in North America who is running a fairly significant enterprise business on top of their network. And they, like many service providers, wanted to launch an SD-WAN service. And they kind of looked at it and they said, look, I could launch SD-WAN and I could put an automation layer around that, and hey, everyone would be happy, right? We launch, we scale, we're efficient, job done. But instead they looked at it and said, actually, SD-WAN's just the starting point. So what we want to do is put in place the right automation strategy, the right automation platform. And yes, SD-WAN will be the first thing that we do on top of that. And that took them about 3 or 6 months to put that platform in place and put SD-WAN on top of it. But because they'd spent the time and effort to put the right platform, the right next generation OSS platform in place effectively, as soon as they'd done SD-WAN, they said, hey, we've got SD-WAN, but now our customers want virtualized CPE, and we can just roll that out pretty quickly because we've already got the platform in place. And then they said, we've now got universal CPE and we've got SD-WAN, let's launch security. And they could do that as well. And then they said, actually, we could offer this as a managed service because we've got a highly automated platform that lets us effectively manage these services for our customers. So they launched managed Wi-Fi and managed security and managed WAN services. And you can start to see how they've built this highly agile business that's letting them launch new services into the market very, very quickly and monetize those services, but operate them in a highly efficient way. And so that's an example of one strategy that one of our customers took that's really working for them.
Interesting. Okay, great. So, I mean, I think it's maybe just to sum up, I think we both agree that automation is kind of the future in an OSS/BSS context. And as you said, we're starting to see some of the early deployments that are having, some positive benefits. But, and obviously as 5G network scale, there's a kind of a renewed focus or the continued focus on automation. I'm just wondering if we look out maybe a year from now, what do you think we'll see in terms of increased automation adoption?
So I think we will see increased automation adoption around 5G. Because as the 5G core network comes into play, that really gives the service providers the ability to run many different networks or many different types of network over that one network, right? And the only way you can make one network appear to be an enterprise network to this customer and a gaming network to this customer and a connected car network to another is to have automation, right? Because you can't handcraft all of those different capabilities on the one network. It just doesn't work. So I think 5G, and as service providers start to really get their 5G networks going nationwide and put the 5G core into place, with that is going to have to come automation, or else we're just going to have voice, data, and text services, right? So that's the first one. I think the second one is as service providers continue down the virtualization path and move to cloud native and put more of their network into the cloud and deploy edge into the network, then we're going to see more automation as well, because those networks and the cloud technologies are a tremendous opportunity to automate, right? They were kind of invented for automation, if you like. So I think that will be the second thing that's really going to drive this. And I think that the third thing is going to be digital. I think all of us want and are coming to expect digital services and digital engagement with all of the companies that we deal with, and service providers are going to need to give us, digital access, or certainly enterprises digital access onto the network, so that you can get what service you want wherever you want it and in the form that you want. And again, that's only really possible if you've got automation all the way from the customer onto the network.
Great points. So Angela, really interesting discussion. Thank you for joining me today and talking about automation, OSS, and monetization, all the key topics I'm sure that are on service providers' top of accomplishment list in 2020, 2021. So thank you for joining me today.
Really nice to be talking to you again, Jim.